So shall we start our session today? Just for those of you, those of us who do not know me, my name is Timur Dadabaev, and I'm a professor of international relations here at the University of Tsukuba. I also serve as the director of special program for Central Asian countries. We'd like to acknowledge that we run this program in partnership with the generous support from Nippon Foundation. So today's talk is on social innovations in post-Soviet countries, which is part also of the spring lineup of the series of lectures on Central Eurasian Studies in East Asia and beyond. Today's talk is to be given by our PhD alumni, Dr. Bakhrom Radjabov. Bakhrom, welcome to the series. We're very happy to have you back. This talk by Bakhrom is going to be followed by the pre-publication talk by Nadia Shutava, who is our also a PhD alumni, on her forthcoming book from Routledge on Japanese whaling and people behind it, which is based on her PhD research here at the University of Tsukuba. The third talk will be given by Ms. Dilnaz Ubaidullayeva, who is our former MA alumni and who is currently a PhD fellow at the Australian National University. She will speak on desecuritizing the internationalization in Uzbekistan's education policy. And the final talk in the spring lineup will be by Dr. Mariam Bibilashvili on her forthcoming book from Palgrave, titled Towards the Normal State, Georgian Foreign Policy Between Russia and the West. In addition, we would also like to invite you to the talk on contextualizing Central Asian migration to East Asia, the case of Uzbek newcomers, which is to be given by myself and Professor Sanad of University of Tokyo, on recently published book on this subject, which include papers by us and by Dr. Mukaddam Ahmedova and Dr. Jasur Soipov. The talk is to be hosted by the Modern Japan History Workshop based at the University of Tokyo this coming Thursday in the evening at 7 o'clock. Please consult for the details on our Twitter and Facebook pages. For those who missed our previous talks or wants to revisit the talks, I would like to invite you to visit our YouTube channel, where all the talks are going to be uploaded as soon as we complete the online session. Now, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Nafisa Insambayeva, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the University of Tsukuba. Nafisa, the floor is yours to introduce Bakhrom and then lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning who is joining us from Central Asia. Today, we're happy to introduce our alumnus of the special program in Japanese and Eurasian Studies, Dr. Bakhrom Radjabov, who is currently serving as an adjunct professor at Webster University, Tashkent campus. And Dr. Radjabov also has an extensive experience in the non-governmental sector, having worked for various international organizations. Today, as Professor Dadabaev mentioned, Dr. Radjabov is going to talk about his upcoming book published by Routledge, which is dedicated to social innovations in post-Soviet states. I will give Dr. Radjabov 30 to 35 minutes for his presentation, after which we will open the floor for any questions that you might have. You can either type up your questions into the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand button on Zoom. So, Dr. Radjabov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, this is an honor, of course, to be back and to see my senseis and fellow friends also online. I can see some familiar names there. There is, of course, a great honor also to present my book first with friends, with colleagues, with senseis at the University of Tsukuba. And of course, many of them are familiar already with the research done by me on social innovations when I used to be a PhD student. There was a special program on Eurasian Studies. if you let me start, I would like to start presenting it. Of course, I have tried to focus within this 30-35 minutes on maybe the most important parts of the book, with the hope that the book will be later, of course, raise the interest and will be possibly purchased then and read by many readers. If you don't mind, I will start my presentation right from here. And so welcome again. I'll be talking mostly about social innovations in post-Soviet countries. When I was a PhD student back in 2019, when I has been graduated from the program from the University of Tsukuba, I was focused on three countries, three post-Soviet countries: Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and Armenia. But this book extended this research to 9 countries overall, namely 4 countries in Central Asia, 3 in Caucasus, and 2 in Eastern Europe, namely Ukraine and Moldova in the end. So I put additional effort then to make research on that countries as well. The book consists of 6 chapters plus introduction, and the body chapters, I would say those are on social innovations in Central Asia, in Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and of course it was well this time, and we still are there in COVID-19 times, and I dedicated a separate chapter to social innovations in these 9 countries that have been generated during the COVID time, mostly as a response to COVID-19. And the last chapter dedicated to analysis and conclusion. Just to start a little bit, all this topic on social innovations, the first things basically the first thing I usually heard when I started the research was, okay, innovations, that should be difficult. This must be a really difficult topic, and it's not really easy to research the topic, to understand and basically social innovations. And I often hear and could read the phrase social innovations is something everybody does, but nobody understands. And this is partly true because one of the puzzles or challenges theoretically was that the concept was not clearly defined. There was not one clear definition of social innovations. So it was not really clear how to measure it, how to understand it, how to define it, etc., etc. So I had plenty of challenges. My senseis know that very well. But over the research, when just trying to handle this topic, of course, I focused on several issues, and this was basically a very conscious option for me, because it was really difficult from the very beginning to cover all. And the goals of this research and of the book was to evaluate social innovation projects that are called SIPs, just briefly. So to evaluate social innovation projects from 2012, when the first social innovation project was introduced based on the data I generated, the first social innovation project introduced in post-Soviet context, and to 2020, basically. And I did so through the evaluation of so-called umbrella organizations, because these organizations were running a lot of small projects that were called by them social innovations. Of course, this gave me the certain kind of handy tool to pick right projects from the variety of different projects run by government, non-government organizations, donors, etc., etc. Then, of course, by default, I have mapped organizations supporting social innovation projects. And when I was doing my research, I realized immediately, and that was reported by many respondents, that they basically don't know, even if you take the social innovations in Central Asia, they don't know who does what. Basically, the government, international organizations, local, informal, there's no pretty much donor coordination that I mentioned later in this presentation. So this book served also kind of the role of basically covering every single experience and new social practice as a social innovation. Contribution to the knowledge here was very important also, and the purpose was to contribute to the knowledge about social innovations through the missing analysis of social innovations in post-Soviet countries. And of course, to do so, it was important to uncover these features, the most important and maybe very specific features, characteristics of social innovations, discuss these characteristics, discuss the evaluation in general of the social innovation projects and the evolution of the social innovation as a concept in the post-Soviet context. So the research in general was significant for three main reasons. I put them very briefly, of course, here. First, focus on SIPs, on social innovation projects in post-Soviet countries. This is, I have mentioned already, including social innovation projects in times of COVID-19. And it was a big separate topic, by the way, on COVID-19. And social innovation projects in general in development work. There was another kind of a big topic within the whole discussion of SIPs in 9 post-Soviet countries. And of course, the evolution and some particular features of social innovation projects that are uncovered by the scholarship that are kind of left out of this mainstream research on social innovations. And when I was doing research, I've immediately then generated this the argument for this research, which is kind of has several parts. The first is to win the government cooperation in post-Soviet countries where the government is kind of really omnipresent everywhere. International donors purposely framed their development projects as social innovations, usually because they were introduced in very sensitive areas for the government. Then, of course, since they have framed them as development projects, the new kind of developmental type of social innovations of a social innovation has emerged then in post-Soviet countries automatically. And in this kind of in this context, social innovations have not been discussed yet in the scholarship. And of course, what usually donors did, they have kind of evaluated or they have conducted basically the projects not post factum, because usually in the scholarship, social innovations is about something that has been already done post factum. But in post-Soviet context, the social innovation projects were mostly evolutional, so they were not yet social innovations per se, as per even the theory and the arguments, but the theory and the evidence from the field, but they've already labeled as such. So this also put some kind of this added an additional feature to SIPs in post-Soviet countries and made them kind of special, and this was not covered yet by the literature. Then the vital importance of the government, of course, and the leaders and policy entrepreneurs, this is how I call them in the book, help to advance social innovation projects in post-Soviet countries. But I've also noticed that social innovations as a concept was losing the meaning in the post-Soviet context, because it was usually interchanged by other concepts, by other terms. The methodology and methods that I've used in the study to write the book finally was, of course, the critical review of the scholarship, first of all, to look at the existing scholarship critically, and then based on that discuss the features of social innovation, of course focusing not only on the literature review part, but also on the theoretical review part, and looking at different theories also. I mentioned them here: connected difference, actor network theory, and then picking up one which would be suitable for the analysis. And I picked the social practice theory in my book. And later also, because the developmental type of the social innovation, I picked the human development theory. And in the book, I justify that, I show why I do so and how I actually apply those theories. Of course, I mentioned it here, so social practice theory, and then later human development theory was applied. And by default, I was looking also on some volitional and developmental features of social innovation. So how this, in fact, made SIPs in post-Soviet countries different from the many others in other parts of the world. The theory and literature helped to identify criteria for evaluation, because this was a crucial part of the whole story about evaluating SIPs, evaluating social innovation projects in post-Soviet countries. So I needed some tangible, reliable, good criteria to evaluate this. And this was, in general, the puzzle, the problem for social innovations. And I applied, of course, those criteria, and there were out here, like 8 criteria in general to evaluate social innovation projects. So it's newness, people-centeredness, networking, collaboration, localness of social innovation projects, use of technology, social impact, scaling up, and then finally making a social change. So I basically argue, and this is not just my argument, but this is based on the literature and theory, the social innovation, or any project to become a social innovation, any initiative to become a social innovation, there has to move from the number 1 to number 8. So to basically fulfill all the 8 criteria. This, of course, made, in fact, the work a bit easier. But the most interesting, at least for me, and most challenging also, especially in COVID-19 times, was to collect the data. Because as I told, I had only 3 countries, and I collected this for my PhD, for this data, but it was not enough. I just mentioned the data collection on the literature and theory review. This is mentioned already. Then I reviewed the project's program documents, which were kind of plenty of different projects and program proposals to review. The informations on the website, social networks also, especially while analyzing the informal networks in times of COVID that contributed to generation of new social innovation projects. So later, of course, the experts interviews and in-depth interviews were added. In general, kind of a total number of organizations I have covered. The number was 20, and this is excluding the informal networks that were quite effective and quite active, again, in times of COVID-19, when the peak of pandemic hit the Central Asian countries and the Caucasian and the East European countries. Over here, you can see these organizations. I have grouped them and put them in a way to demonstrate based on the countries and then on different sectors. So to which sector certain organization was belonging to. For instance, in Kazakhstan, it was UNICEF and Astana Hub doing social innovations, and in fact, running social innovation lab. And this was a clear kind of part of the story where the international donor and the government was cooperating to run social innovations. but at the same time, it was Eurasian Foundation, which kind of was representing the non-governmental sector, also doing social innovations, or USAID, just poorly an international donor, also, by the way, running social innovations. And at the first glance, it could look like the landscape is so empty, nobody does social innovation, it's not, the topic is not pronounced, but in fact, if you look deeper, if you start analyzing, you see a lot of donors engaged already there, and in fact saying that they are running social innovations, which they usually don't. And on the criteria, just some findings maybe here on newness. This is what was found, that the SIPs were contextually new usually, and everybody recognized that it's not something entirely new. Everybody understands that these regions are maybe a bit of, far from the innovation hubs of the globe, but still they were running the social innovation projects. Some of them were lacking newness. There was a challenge also, especially in the non-governmental sector, where the old-fashioned NGOs were trying to run social innovations, but couldn't, in fact. People-centeredness was always on, the focus on inclusiveness, on engaging with individuals, in fact, asking people before running the social innovation projects. This was kind of a prevailing trend in all post-Soviet countries, but not always, because not all social innovation projects were user-driven. A lot of cases are on, when the government is running social innovation projects, quite, by the way, inefficiently sometimes. But this was found on. So, and of course, here on networking and collaboration, this is another criteria of social innovation, as you remember. So here I found a strong manifestation of collaboration across multiple sectors, which is a good sign for social innovations in post-Soviet countries, because this is how this should work, in fact. So social innovation, and this is already a mainstream argument in the scholarship, social innovation is not something run by, for instance, the third sector, the non-governmental sector. Some post-Soviet countries still do this mistake. They think that NGOs should run social innovations because social innovations are supposed to satisfy some social needs, which they should, of course, but this doesn't mean that they should be kind of run only by non-governmental sector. But still, the evidence from the post-Soviet countries is that NGOs and some grassroots organizations or informal networks are cooperating better. But the cooperation with government is not very efficient or not very successful. And it's really low donor coordination, of course. And sometimes donors even hide, surprisingly, what they do from each other. SIPs launched locally, usually, and they aimed usually on specific domain, local governance, social services, healthcare, support, etc., which is a different, by the way, from many other social innovations in the globe, because usually, again, social innovations, they are not always focused on the certain realm. They basically try to cross-cut not only different sectors when they are generated, but also different purposes when they are in fact applied in practice. Use of technology, by the way, was again a prevailing trend. When I was doing my PhD at the University of Tsukuba, I found that, for instance, in Central Asia, Uzbekistan was not really kind of a good example of, or an example where the technologies are used. But over time, this has changed. And now all these social innovation projects usually try to use, and they actually use ICTs, different IT solutions, open data, civic technologies to basically run the social innovation projects. And this is quite a successful and good examples out there. It's still problematic to measure social impact. Many organizations that are running, as they call it, social innovations, do not really think about measuring the impact. They don't really know how to measure it. They don't have handy instruments. They are so far not even thinking about that, or they have a very primitive, very simple way of measuring what they did. Yeah, and this is kind of a challenge also to argue that they actually do social innovations. Scaling is really a problem also. It's slow or to medium manifestation across the post-Soviet countries of the scaling. And here you could find or see, observe the direct correlation with the government collaboration. And here I'm saying it again because it was all about the networking criteria, saying that in fact, governments or absence of collaboration with governments make it challenging to scale up social innovations. And it's not only about funding the projects, it's in fact on some institutional support of the projects to make them really scalable later. And it's slow progress of integration into the cultural and societal fabric or the context. It's still very difficult. Usually social innovation project, this was found also not in all countries, maybe except some of them, still need support. They still need to be integrated. It's really not easy, it's slow. Why? We can discuss this, of course, if I receive such questions, but in general, this is the finding. On evolution, again, there was found that, of course, the projects are evolutional, that basically there's still something that can be worked towards. They're developmental because international development organizations supported a lot the social innovation project. And this, by the way, explains my previous point that why they're not really integrated. There's not enough demand for social innovation projects. Therefore, they're not really rapidly integrated into social context and not really rapidly making the social change. But they're kind of backed up by the international donors usually, with their money, of course, which is not enough to institutionalize them. And there is a danger of diluting the social innovation concepts and intermixing them, in fact, with other terms. And I even raised the point, if at all, the concept should be used, because a lot of organizations are using really different terms. Maybe they are not really willing to run social innovation projects, and it's still unclear why they still label them as social innovations. Again, lack of newness was a clear finding. Though the projects are aimed to satisfy goals and needs, networking and collaboration, of course, presents a challenge, again, for social innovation implementation in post-Soviet context. Social innovation impact assessment is problematic, no clear indicators to even evaluate the projects. The social innovations could be scaled in some countries like Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, but not everywhere. And there are certain prerequisites for this scaling. We can discuss this, of course, why I do discuss this in my book. And it's slow social change happening. The bottom-up approach is there for project design, especially in Central Asia. It's absence of the donor coordination, as I have mentioned, and the government support is key usually for the project to make them sustainable. Hopeful signs, and this was also found, of scaling, of in fact making social innovations out of social innovation projects is observed in Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. I think this is all. I just put it here as some later research of mine on post-Soviet countries, because of course the research is needed, and we just recently did with colleagues one in Kyrgyzstan on city innovations, and some conferences in Uzbekistan, and papers for colleagues in the US. I stop here. I hope I was not running too much out of the time, and I would love to answer to your questions. maybe to shed an additional light on what I have written and told now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bakhrom. I would like to open the floor for any questions. You can, again, either type them up in the chat box, or you can raise your hand through the raise your hand button on Zoom. I guess while people are collecting their questions, I want to ask you two questions regarding your study. First of all, you've mentioned the prerequisites for scaling up social innovation projects in certain countries as opposed to others. So I was wondering what those are and how you evaluated their readiness for scaling up. And also, I think a lot of our listeners would be curious to learn how you can turn your graduate thesis into a book publication, what that sort of process looks like, what are some of the challenges, and something that to keep in mind in order for that to happen.
Thank you, Nafis. Thank you for these two wonderful questions. First of all, on prerequisites for scaling up social innovations. And here I would like to mention that those prerequisites were very different. For example, in countries like Ukraine, the clear prerequisite was to have a strong civil society, because what has happened in Ukraine, for example, the strong civil society organizations were even lobbying certain laws in the parliament of Ukraine. For instance, the law on or the chart, they call it the chart on open data. And this chart made it possible for many startups, or they call it also social startups, to use the data, which now should have been made available by all government organizations, local governance level, national government, any. So the law made it compulsory for the government organizations to make the data available. And the social startups started using this data, for instance, on the issues of the rush hours, the trafficking in Lviv, for example, or in times of COVID in Moldova, it was used, for instance, the data generated by the clinics or by the apps that were created to and used by the people to diagnose COVID. This data was used also to navigate people and to take additional pressure from the hospitals, from the clinics, especially in times of the peak of the disease in the country. So this was done by the great support of the civic sector. Differently from that, for instance, in Central Asia, even for instance in Azerbaijan, in Caucasus, a lot of efforts were made by the government, or the kind of the expectation to run the project was that the government will be supporting this project, and this has happened. And the finding also there, or the evidence is telling that the COVID also pushed a lot this the technological advancement. For instance, when the Ministry of Health of Azerbaijan then started asking or cooperating with UNDP on more digitalizing the medical care services in Baku. They were running some pilot project there in some clinics. But this is also in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, for example, or in Uzbekistan, or in Kyrgyzstan, where without the government, for example, in Bishkek, they could not create the city dashboard with some social problems mapped and then the solutions generated for this project. So different actors were engaged, and every different maybe context, or even the country was looking for different prerequisites to institutionalize, to basically introduce these social innovation projects and introduce them sustainably, so that they will be then owned by the national partner and then run and be more sustainable. On the second question you have asked, of course, the whole process was was not fast on turning my PhD thesis into the book. First of all, because when I've started submitting my proposal to different academic publishers, Routledge had two reviewers, the blind reviewers, then commenting on my proposal, and the advice from them was, of course, one of the advices was to maybe extend then my PhD or what I found or had on for my PhD to more post-Soviet countries, and then really not only cover the social innovation project supported by UNDP or by any donor, but to take kind of more of a bigger picture. And then the reviewers thought that this would be interesting also to see who is supporting social innovations post-Soviet countries, how it works, and what are the good results, maybe interesting outcomes out there. And then this was my decision also to extend this work, because I realized that it will be an additional work. And at the time when I received this offer, we didn't know, nobody knew that the COVID will happen and it will be just difficult to even contact people. Everybody was sick and so on. So it was very challenging times, of course. And it took, I think, over a year also in my case to contact people, to collect data. I had very interesting stories on that data collection. Maybe one day I will write a book about how to collect data, how to conduct interviews with different organizations and different people in post-Soviet countries. I had some good examples and some really unprofessional approach of the respondents, but yeah, this is part of the whole process. And of course, later on with the publisher, with editing, with everything, I think I went through, and this was a valuable experience, I mean, going through the whole process from the very start and of the drafting the proposal to the very end when all the proofreads are done, and then the manuscript is sent to production.
Thank you very much for your response, Bakhrom. Do we have any questions? Yeah, we have a raised hand. Yes, Professor Dadabaev.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bakhrom, for your talk. This is indeed, I can feel there is a lot which added up to your thesis, both geographically, but also conceptually. And, I would like to congratulate you. I think, to some extent, this is perhaps, one of the first, if not the first, manuscript on social innovations covering this post-Soviet space. And in that particular sense, both geographically, but also as a concept, this is a, breakthrough of its own in terms of contribution to academic knowledge on this subject matter. Now, having said that, I have many questions, but, I would like to pose few just to share, your experience with others. The first thing is that, my very basic question is, you have this title of post-Soviet space. And I thought, do you feel this is a sort of proper framing to give to this country? So do you think, that in the future we would move perhaps, to geographic sort of coverage of these areas? And so the second question is kind of connected to this. I've realized you have different chapters by different regions, which I thought is a very smart move. But I'm just wondering if you feel that there are certain factors which are typical for each region and which are not seen in others. And in that process, what is the the role of indigenous knowledge in constructing the innovations, social innovations? And the final question that the third question that I had relates to this. The factors. You mentioned different factors, which is which I feel is relevant. However, what we know from the biggest challenges to social innovations, that there are three facets, yeah, passion, capacity, and ability. And it seems to me that, this passion part is, quite present in all of these, studies and regions. Now, in terms of capacity and ability, we see different sort of, features in different countries and different regions. So I'm just wondering, in your own research, when you went through this, post-Soviet space, in which sort of regions, perhaps, you see more capacity and passion and less ability, while what are the other areas where you have more abilities but not so much passion, let's say. So it would be nice to have your view on this. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Sensei. First of all, yes, I think that maybe, and this is again the debate, also ongoing debate on framing the post-Soviet or maybe some giving some other geographical more of a definition on the social innovations in this case, and of course maybe over time this will change. I think for the publisher also, and for me personally, it was interesting more, and this was in fact part of the argument also, to look on more post-Soviet social innovations, though in the literature, of course, you can find another definition like post-communist, and with post-communist, it's kind of the coverage is bigger than the research already done, and a lot of findings are there on, for instance, countries like the former countries of the communist bloc, for instance, in Bulgaria or on Hungary, on the others. And the kind of the approach in general, and the core idea of this of the book and of the research was to look more on a very specific, and this is kind of the argument also, specific post-Soviet social innovations. Why? Because the whole study started with more of looking on developmental work of donors done, first of all, globally, first started in this post-Soviet former USSR republics. And this was specific feature of the whole discussion about the post-Soviet social innovations. But this should not be always like that. Of course, this can, and I think over time, will change, since the debate and the scholarship and in fact the social innovation is really integrated now globally, and people learn from each other, projects learn from each other, and this happens. This, I think, over time will also change the overall notion on that. On the second question, of course, let me then explain the patient and capability part. First of all, surprisingly, well, to me, it was a surprise. A lot of organizations, for instance, in Central Asia, were really trying to run social innovations over time. It took some of them a couple of years. In some cases, it was more than just 1 or 2 years of running social innovations. And the general concern was that it's not a high demand for social innovations. These organizations were usually inventing and reinventing the new approach to deal with old social problems. Not always successfully, but this was done. And in general, the capacity is not very high, unfortunately. And it starts from the very beginning, from, in fact, understanding what social innovation is. And therefore, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, after I presented the research, they have Social Innovation Lab Kyrgyzstan. And as it is, this Social Innovation Lab is unique even for Central Asia, because well, if you compare to Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, For example, this lab is run by the sponsoring organization and by the academic institution. In Kazakhstan, it's run by the international donor and the government. And this is a kind of changes completely the approach they've applying. And of course, this makes the whole story different, but the capacity is still missing. Why? Because it was not clear for the Social Innovation Lab, though they are called a Social Innovation Lab, they did not understand how to conceptualize social innovation, at least in the context of Kyrgyzstan. And we helped, I hope, to contextualize the Social Innovation Lab. And this is, by the way, despite the research already done. And in fact, it was called the Atlas of Social Innovations, covered Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia, recently published, still not helpful to understand how to run it. Again, on capacity, interest, and of course, the patient. Yes, with that is also kind of, was a lot of desire, in fact, to run social innovations, especially in the non-governmental sector. And for instance, a donor like USAID was helping in Kazakhstan, for example. They even launched a special course on social innovations for NGOs. But again, if you look out there, and they were in fact recognizing that fact even during the interviews, many third sector, the NGOs basically were offering old ideas without any innovation in it, newness, not any new social practice that could be a change maker in the social context. And then if you look even institutionally, countries are not ready for this change, because for real social innovation to happen, of course, certain, as I've mentioned, at least as in Ukraine, some legal acts should be there. Some social changes should happen, institutional changes should happen, and the idea or the message I received from many respondents was that if the government is not engaged, not interested, unfortunately, these projects will not be sustainable soon. And on your second question, I think the second question was
on features of different regions.
And the features, and say yes, this even not in the regions. I've just mentioned the case of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, two neighboring countries, but approaching social innovations differently. Even the actors are different. And Kyrgyzstan, in fact, happened to be in Central Asia a unique case for social innovations. Not only by because different actors were engaged. For instance, in Uzbekistan, the government was not, from 2012, when I was writing my PhD, from 2012 to 2019, not really interested in social innovations. Social innovations were run by UNDP. Nobody was interested. They've just tried, piloted, failed, but there was only UNDP, and there was a problem. Later, after 2018, when in Uzbekistan, government decided to create the Ministry of Innovation, or the Ministry of Innovational Development. And then they've created this nationwide movement called Yükseliş. They've also started running innovation projects, like really social innovation projects, through the USAID-sponsored Partnership for Innovation project. So you see, this has changed. Only just in Uzbekistan over like 6-7 years. But if you look again only on Central Asia, you see that Kyrgyzstan is different case, Kazakhstan is different, and Uzbekistan is different. But if you look then over the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan, you see that they have a big agency, a state agency created on the decree of the president, called on public services and social innovations. And of course, as an outsider, you can never get an interview with them. but yeah, they are running social innovation. If you look, they have a lot of products under the ASAN, they call it ASAN umbrella. The agency is running there, and it's more on public sector innovations, on more digitalizing some public services usually. But they also have a private sector engaged them. They have social innovation lab in Baku, also unfortunately not really successful in replying to the requests for interview, but they have it, and we see here the private sector also engaged, because unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, but the picture is, at least in Central Asia, many believe that this is really a social innovation as a work of a third sector of NGOs, that the NGOs should, even when I was invited to speak, NGOs, representatives of NGOs were 100% sure that this is something they should do and nobody should really engage, or they're not in favor of even engaging sometimes with the government, which is a big mistake. But nobody talks about private sector engagement or cross-cutting of social innovations, which the theory and the literature, the evidence from many other countries clearly demonstrate that this should be the path. So you see, I have tried to depict a little bit of the whole story, but this is very different, and this is what I think makes it very interesting to to research and to understand how it works differently in different contexts.
Thank you very much. Bakhrom, just one sort of follow-up. By saying that, that many of these projects and initiatives were initiated by international organizations and NGOs, can we assume that many of these so-called social innovations are brought into the societies from abroad? So these are not necessarily indigenous sort of driven in a sense. And do you see this as a trend that we need to be a bit concerned about?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning this, and I think I missed this, and you in fact asked that. The story here is very different. Again, I give you an example. In Kyrgyzstan, for example, the Social Innovation Lab thinks that even, for instance, in redesigning the city of Bishkek, old Soviet practices, forgotten Soviet practices, could be used and could be quite innovative now for Bishkek. So it's old and it's Soviet, everybody understands that. In Kazakhstan, for instance, NGOs and donors think that, again, Kazakhstan is far from the technological innovation centers, and first, even making any project human-centered and asking people before designing it is already a big innovation. And half joking, I was received this reply from one respondent. But they also look at different, for instance, very good working solutions in different parts of the globe, and they do not hesitate to transmit them to the Kazakh case, for instance, to make them run in Kazakhstan, if of course this is this works. But the major problem everywhere in the post-Soviet countries is that not even some kind of external experience is transmitted, but in fact the absence of need, the absence of institutional memory. Many projects are done already and maybe failed or were successful, but still nobody knows, and new people come and they again start the same projects. Usually they don't even aware that they was tested already. So they don't keep this memory with them. And of course, they're very reluctant to new kind of, I would say, buzzwords like innovations, and they are ready to add this to the experience, even if this is not innovation at all. For instance, I received once a response that SMM, this is social media marketing, was considered as innovation. And they told, oh, we did this and that. But I mean, this is a problem. Nobody measures, nobody has this criteria in front of them to tell, oh, this is social innovation and this is not. So this is the reality sometimes.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bakhrom. If I can ask one more question regarding social innovations. You've actually mentioned that there are other success cases in other countries. So I would like to hear more details about if we're saying that there's a risk of this concept being diluted in the post-Soviet space, what are we comparing this against? What is the culprit or the standard in your own opinion? And you've also mentioned that in some countries, the private sector is involved. And there are some practices that have been proven very successful. So can you please elaborate on that? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for this question. And the standard, of course, even the criteria I came up for this book and for the research, they were generated from the literature, from, again, different cases from the series. Here, this is first, of course, a tricky thing that any researcher should be aware of, and the choices, in fact, that I had to make to run this project. First, on the criteria, on the standards. So what are the standards for social innovation? Because and I'm pretty sure senseis they remember there was a challenging part for my PhD also to basically look what is social innovation and what is not. Since the definition is not there, it's not clear, and usually the practice is kind of running ahead the theory, and the series usually trying to catch up on in the topic of social innovations. It was important to come up with certain standards, and those standards, of course, they are not out of the blue. They are based on the literature and theory. This is something, these 8 criteria that make any project a social innovation. If it's called so, if it's supposed to become a social innovation, then they should be meeting this standard, this criteria. What we found out, or what I found out in post-Soviet countries, first of all, for instance, in countries like Ukraine or in Moldova, sometimes in Armenia, those innovations, there was not any agreement on if it is social innovation or not. In some cases, respondents told me that, oh, we don't call this social innovation, we call this project a civic technology. Or we don't call this social innovation, we call this project a public sector innovation. And they gave kind of their own definitions, or they start explaining how they distinguish, how they differentiate among all of that. And of course, the problem here is if you as an organization, and it was easy to pick this organization because they were saying we are social innovation lab, or we are running social innovation projects, and then you start evaluating this project and you see that then over time of implementing these projects, the definitions of them change, and then some criteria left out. And the ultimate problem is then nobody, in fact, cares if the project has passed all 8 stages to become a real social innovation. Therefore, many of them either fail or they just remain some of the local, not really important, not really social change making projects. And the standards here is there. I've used them to basically look of even the organization called something as civic technology. Then you put, you apply the or I applied the standards and see if this, what is called civic technology or public sector innovation, is qualified to be a social innovation. Because I knew, and we all know that, I mean, the theorists and the scholars know that social innovation, and I mentioned that also in my presentation, are implemented in different realms. It could be in healthcare, so why not to call it the healthcare innovation? or in governance, why not to call it again public sector innovation or governance innovation? This I have handled, and in the book solved this problem for the reader and for myself by just applying this 8 criteria and looking if what is called social innovation in any sector is in fact social innovation or can be qualified against these 8 criteria. This was again partly easy because the organizations were calling them social innovation labs or projects or whatever, and they were arguing that the purpose of their development assistance or the government support or NGO support was to run and introduce social innovations. So I evaluated critically if this was true.
Yes, and the second part of my question was more about specific examples, either regional or country-wise, country cases, where that you think are success cases in terms of social innovations projects, and also how the private sector could be involved. What is sort of an example that we could follow, we should aspire to, in terms of a concrete example? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nafiza. Yes, for instance, one example I take, for instance, from Armenia, when we had the case where in Yerevan, 3 big schools, very prestigious schools, were not really transparent on taking the kids to study in the school. So parents were not aware if the slot is empty or not. So there was usually the heads, directors of the schools, kind of a kings, they're deciding. And of course, once this is the case, this is a room for corruption. And what the Kolba Lab in that case did, the organizations that I've evaluated, they've introduced the technology part. So the technology on making the selection process transparent. So anybody could use the app, any parent could use the app or the website to look if, for instance, there is a space for the kid to get into the school. And of course, taking out this decision-making power from the directors and getting it to the parents already solved locally this the problem of corruption. Or in Ukraine, they were running a project, well, not a good example, but still they were doing this in the cemeteries in Kiev, in local cemetery. And even getting a land from the cemetery was a huge corruption. People had to pay in advance to get the land. And just digitalizing this service already took away this corruption element. I am giving now examples on more of governance or more transparency, but there was a case also in Baku, in the healthcare sector, where due to COVID, the health sector was in huge demand to create some technological, again, devices or technological solutions to let doctors consult the patients to avoid the human contact, to avoid, for instance, the transmission of the infection. Or in Moldova, the same. They use the app to again see how the people are navigating throughout the Chisinau or throughout the whole Moldova, then to get the medical care. And they were using this data to report and to get the clinics more prepared for the peak of the people coming, or to make it more kind of mild on a negative effect of people, a lot of people coming at once, and then overwhelming than the clinics and the doctors. Or, for instance, in Georgia, there was the case on innovation in the local governance, called the local government in Rustavi city, where they've managed, for example, as in Armenia, also managed, for example, the waste. And they've created an app and then added this app to the communal services, to community services, where the correct waste management then could be very beneficial economically for the local households. If they waste or they manage the waste correctly, then it's good for the environment, of course, and this is good for in terms of costs for the households, because they pay less than if they do it correctly. And if they do it incorrectly, of course, there are the penalties. So those kind of some small solutions that if scaled, and they are scaled usually throughout the whole countries, and then became a norm, a new social practice that is then changing the existing old, not efficient social practice, over time can make a huge social change in the society. And this is how the social innovation, starting from the local SIP, like social innovation project, implemented maybe in one community, over time can be scaled up to the level of social change.
Thank you very much for this response. If we have any more questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat or raise your hand. I would like to ask one more question, because your study, as Professor Dadabaev said, and yourself, it's like the first milestone in terms of being the first research on social innovation in post-Soviet space. So since we have a lot of aspiring researchers here as well listening to you, could you please indicate what is the future of research on social innovation in our countries? Where do you see more research gaps that require more research done in the field?
Thank you. This is a good question. I haven't thought yet, but now, of course, I realized already through my research that there are the gaps. And since after my research, after even submitting my manuscript, I have started receiving requests from different countries and organizations, even to conduct some additional research. I would say that what is missing now is the data, because even if you look on social innovation index, and some time ago the Economist has published that, and it was a global index, and they've used a lot of data, you could see that the post-Soviet space, it's kind of a black box. Still not enough data is there. Not enough data is generated to conduct later on kind of more convincing and more kind of, I would not use the word serious, but a more of comprehensive and more deep research. Out there, I would say, and there was something I was missing also, to go deeper, to look at specific projects, good examples of specific projects, and then to really dive deeper. To take more interviews, to conduct more interviews with not only with those running social innovation projects, but also with those consuming, basically, or those affected by the social innovation projects. And in fact, again, go deeper, collect more data, help to better conceptualize social innovations. We have started this partly, me and the colleague of mine was collecting data in Kyrgyzstan also, and we immediately realized that a lot of projects, sometimes called and sometimes not really called social innovations, but which are really unique in certain areas, they are conducted. Those projects are mentioned in different publications like the Atlas of Social Innovations and the others, but we don't have sufficient information about them. We don't know a lot of details. Again, we cannot be sure that they are making this social innovation change. The theories are not properly applied usually, and this still the understanding of what is social innovation is very different, and we need more research, more in-depth analysis of the trend, because the trend is clearly ongoing, and post-Soviet countries are not an exception from the global trend. We need to understand how the, for instance, frameworks, entrepreneurial network, entrepreneurial framework, social framework, political framework, and institutional frameworks. So these four at least work out to build a good ecosystem for social innovations. So far, we don't know that.
Thank you very much for your detailed response.
Bakhrom, just
Yes.
just to follow up on this. So, because initially you suggested that government sometimes plays a crucial role, yeah, and for a future sort of trajectory, you see the connection between entrepreneurship and social innovation. So, do you see that's the trend? Do you see that we need to perhaps when we see social innovations associated with the government, we see a lot of misunderstanding and perhaps even misuse, because that is connected to the funds, right? And when we see perhaps entrepreneurship and social innovation connected, there is a different pattern sort of relationship between the two. Is this what you're trying to suggest?
Yes, exactly. And of course, this is a whole different, maybe big topic on innovations run by the donors or by the government. And my stand is here that innovations, and this is a global experience, usually run by, in general, not social innovations, but innovations are run by the private sector. And even from my modest research for the book, I could see that social innovations run by the government or by the donor, usually not efficient. It's a lot of misuse of funds. And again, for instance, if we are talking about private sector, if you look at the numbers of the money that, for instance, government, the donor, ready to give away for an innovation project, the amount of money is really modest. For instance, a good one, well, I don't want to mention the country, but still, I will give you the numbers, like 100,000 or 100 million even US dollars for innovations. Sounds great for certain countries, but in fact, if you compare with kind of a global experience, you see that one good startup for one good exit can make this money, even for the first round, can just raise this money, one startup. And now we are talking about a lot of money spent by the government, the taxpayers' money, for the risky business. And the innovations is in 99% is failure. And entrepreneurs, many of them they do not survive first 5 years. So this is a lot. And then, of course, for innovations, for innovators, for social entrepreneurs or for entrepreneurs, it's then bureaucratically also difficult to report about the money spent. And it's not only in the countries I have analyzed, the same is in Russia, for example. And the general advice is for the government, if the government, for example, wants to invest, it's better to invest in fundamental science and to let innovations, startups, social or not social entrepreneurs to run their business on their own, and to better allow them to raise funds from other sources globally, because money for any projects like that, for innovations, are more than enough in the world. So if the country is good connected to for the financial markets, and just basically has a good internet and no restrictions on the transactions for the purpose of innovation, so it would be more than enough. So money would not be a problem. The problem is usually on the science, on running, for example, deep technology projects. You need a very good, connected, established, very serious, fundamental basics of science to run good startups or deep tech projects. For social innovations, is the same. And social entrepreneurs, they're going kind of hand in hand with social innovators, as in many countries, not only in developed and rich countries. Take the example of Bangladesh, of Muhammad Yunus with microcrediting. This is basically a good, unique idea with now different comments on that, but still a good thing to do. And this was, again, done by the social entrepreneur. And it's there basically. So the basic advice may be not to challenge, but in fact to support this and to take away donors, because donors, well, I talked about government, but the donors is the same. They are basically reporting about, they have their own metrics, outcomes, indicators, and they're interested more on development impact. And mixing it up with innovations, even in social sector, makes it really, first of misuse of donors' money, and then not really efficient, achieving the goal. But when the private sector, when the person, the entrepreneur, spends or raises its own money and spends it, by default, the person is interested to be more efficient, to run the project more efficiently, to team up with the experts, etc., etc. Therefore, when I've got this from my interviews with donor organizations, name it UNDP, USAID, UNICEF, whoever you take it, there was the same problem. They were complaining that they do not receive good ideas. They don't have enough capacitated people to run these projects, but they never ask themselves, this is my feeling, why this happens. And in fact, this is because they are usually the problem.
Thank you very much. Bakhrom, when is the book coming? This is the question that we need to ask you.
Yes, Sensei, the due date is the June 2nd. But as far as I know from the publisher, the electronic version can be already pre-ordered, and the electronic version will be delivered 2-3 weeks before the hard copy, before the due date.
We are looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us today, Bakhrom. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. As Dr. Radjabov said, his book can be pre-ordered now, and it will be available sometime around June. We will see you next time during our next public lecture, which is going to take place on May 23rd at 12:15 p.m. Tokyo time. And we are going to host another alumnus of the special program in Japanese and Eurasian Studies, Dr. Nadia Shutova, and she will speak about her publication titled Japanese Whaling and the People Behind It. So please tune into that lecture as well. And Bakhrom, thank you once again for coming.
Thank you for inviting. Thank you again. If I may, I just want to thank everybody, and thank you, Dadabaev Sensei, for inviting me. Thank you, all the colleagues, and that was wonderful. And thank you for citing my modest contribution on social remittances. This is another very interesting and promising topic. I hope I can continue this and maybe extend it to a more broader and interesting kind of good publication, maybe book. It's really an interesting, and I'm glad that all the colleagues and Sensei also engaged now in the whole discussion on migration and remittances and so on. So thank you again, and looking forward to seeing you once again soon.
Thank you very much, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.